There you go. G'day, mate. Hi guys, welcome to the brain and cranial nerves exercise today that we'll be going through. There's a range of structures that we'll look at both on the cadaver brains that we have as well as the cranial vault and the models. I'll try and go through everything and explain it pretty clearly. I'll also have information in a PowerPoint in conjunction with this that kind of elaborates further on the functions and everything that you need to know as well. So to start off with, understanding that the different lobes of the brain that helps assemble it. So this here is obviously a whole cadaver brain, as you can see like this. So this frontal part here would be the frontal lobe of the brain. Now the frontal lobe can be responsible for emotional control, decision making, or anything like that. The next one we have is our parietal lobes up here. Now we have our left and right parietal lobe, and they've come just after that frontal lobe there. Now the parietal lobe has a very wide range of functions, but two of the most common ones is taste and language processing. And then over here on either side of the brain, we have the temporal lobe as well. So the temporal lobe is responsible for hearing and smell. And then right here on the posterior side of the brain, we have our occipital lobe, which is responsible for vision. The next things you need to know are the sulcuses that help divide the brain. So understanding that you have two different features, you have a sulcus and gyri or gyri. So a sulcus is an indentation or something down, and a gyri is what comes up as technically a mountain, and these together help form these folds in your brain. And what these folds do is they exponentially increase the surface area of your brain, so we can essentially have more processing power, or more surface area, so we can have more neurons and everything too. So first one you need to know is we have our central sulcus. So our central sulcus is the one that runs and helps divide your frontal from your parietal lobe. So on this brain, you can see a very good example of it right along here, where it comes up, and you can trace it right to the midline here of the brain. The next one is the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus divides the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe, and you would find the lateral sulcus here. The next one you need to know is your longitudinal fissure. Your longitudinal fissure is this fissure that incompletely divides the left and right hemisphere of your brain, allowing for differentiation. So essentially that means that we have the left and right hemisphere, and they're separated, but they're connected by something that sits deep to this longitudinal fissure called the corpus callosum. You can't see it too well on the whole brain, but you can on the brain models and the half brain that I'll go through. But the corpus callosum is responsible for basically acting like a highway that connects the left and right hemisphere together and allows them to communicate with one another. And then the last thing you need to know for the first page of your lab packet is the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is just basically the outer layer of the brain, and that's composed of folded grey matter as opposed to white matter, which sits deep to the grey matter in this instance. The white matter is your myelinated neurons, and they're responsible for transmitting information, where the grey matter is more responsible for being the actual neurons that do processing and information and all that as well. So now we are looking at the underside of the whole brain just to try and find a few more structures in the next table of the lab packet. So all those structures you can't see on the whole brain, but the ones that you can see, I'll point out, and I will elaborate on the others either on one of the models or on the half brain. So the ones that you can see is this large anterior bulge here that comes off. So that there is your pons. That has a really wide range of functions, but two of the more common functions is it plays a role in sleeping and dreaming as well. And then here where you have the start of your brainstem, which is this part here, that's your medulla oblongata. Now that functions as your cardiac and respiratory center, so it has a really big function in maintaining your respiratory rate and your heart rate. These things are a bit harder to see, but the next thing you have is your mammillary bodies. Now, your mammillary bodies sit slightly superior and anterior to your pons, just up here in this little crevice. You have two mammillary bodies on either side, and they're just these small little rounded bulges. Now, your mammillary bodies play a really big role in memory. The next thing that you can see is this part of the brain here that sits separate to your cerebrum is your cerebellum. Now, your cerebellum, much like your brain, is composed into a left and right hemisphere. Your cerebellum is responsible for a wide range of coordinating muscle movements, fine motor control, and everything too. So you have obviously what would be your left and right hemisphere of your cerebellum. One of the key differences between how the cerebellum works compared to your cerebrum is with your cerebrum, or the larger part of your brain, it works contralaterally. So the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. With the cerebellum, the right side of the cerebellum controls the right side of your body. So it's what's called ipsilateral. And that's one of the areas where crossing over does not occur of neurons. On the cerebellum, we have something called the vermis. The vermis is this indentation here that helps differentiate the left and right hemisphere. So this part right here, one way that I remember it is vermis, vermin. It kind of looks like it's been chewed away at. So a vermin's kind of eaten at it. The vermis is responsible for regulation of muscle tone. So it's what basically helps keep you, regulate tone, standing upright, or keeping that tension in your body and everything too. The last thing that you can see here is if we gently fold this cerebellum back, just here, where we still have part of that brainstem forming up, we have these four large bulges. These four large bulges are called our corpora quadrigemina, and it's differentiated into two different regions. So we have our superior colliculi, which sit more superiorly, and then our inferior colliculi, which obviously sit more inferior. The superior colliculi is responsible for our vision reflex. So an example of the vision reflex would be, say you're driving and you see someone run a red light, so you slam your brakes down. So your vision reflex was that you saw that person was going to crash into you, and your reflex was slam the brakes. The inferior colliculi is responsible for your auditory or your hearing reflex. So an example of that might be, you're sitting in the classroom, you hear a really loud bang across the room, and everyone turns their attention to that. That would be an example of your auditory reflex working. So now we are looking at the half brain here. So in this case, we have just the left side of the brain that we're looking at, just so we can see these structures that are hidden by the whole brain. So just to kind of go through the important ones that you can see, I'll kind of be jumping between the first two tables here. So please just try and keep up with what you can and just fill it out accordingly. So the first thing that you can see is this large projection here is your corpus callosum. And as I was describing before, that corpus callosum is responsible for acting as a band of nerve fibers that help connect the left and right hemisphere of your brain and allow them to essentially communicate with one another. And then we can see the structures of the thalamus and everything as well. So the thing we have here is our thalamus. Our thalamus is essentially the one ring to rule them all, as Scott Taylor calls it. Essentially, that plays a role in synaptic relay. So your thalamus really is responsible for, transmitting incoming information from the brainstem to the right part of the brain and ensuring that it goes there. It also plays a role in, filtering messages and regarding it whether it's important or not. So a really fun fact about the thalamus is, so you wake up in the morning and you first put a t-shirt on. When you first put that t-shirt on, you're wearing it, you feel it touching your body. Eventually, after a few minutes, you forget you're wearing it. So what's happening is your free nerve endings and your touch receptors all over your skin are still sending messages to your brain saying, hey, something's touching me, I feel I'm wearing a shirt. But eventually, your thalamus gets to a point where it says, okay, well, this isn't an important message, ignore it. So you stop perceiving that sense, so you kind of adapt to it. And the reason for that is conservation of energy. So eventually the thalamus says, okay, ignore this message, conserve energy for something else. So slightly anterior to the thalamus, so this is the thalamus, slightly anterior here, we have our hypothalamus. Now, our hypothalamus plays a really big role in assisting endocrine function, so production of hormones and hormone messengers and all of that. Directly attached to the hypothalamus, we would have our pituitary gland. However, in this case, when it comes to removing the brain from the cranial vault, we can't extract the pituitary gland with it, so it doesn't come with it, but the pituitary gland, if it was present, would be here, connected to this stalk. And this stalk right here is called your infundibulum. And your infundibulum is what connects your pituitary gland to your hypothalamus. Directly posterior to the thalamus, so somewhere back here roughly, we have our epithalamus. Our epithalamus is responsible for maintaining our limbic system. And the epithalamus also works in conjunction with our pineal gland, which is really hard to see on this half brain, but the pineal gland is responsible for our sleep-wake cycle or our circadian rhythm. So it produces, obviously, what makes us feel sleepy, which is melatonin. So then, as I was discussing before with the whole brain, this large anterior bulge here is our pons. So that pons is responsible for sleeping and dreaming and things like that. Then as we come further down here into this brainstem and medulla oblongata, we have the cardiac and respiratory centers. And then if we just jump back to the cerebellum here, we can see that we have these projected fibers that look like a tree. And what that is, it's called the arbor vitae or arbor vitae. And what that is essentially it helps connect projections to and from the cerebellum, so it acts as input and output fibers. And arbor vitae essentially means tree of life. So what it's saying, if you kind of look at it close up, it does somewhat resemble a tree with branches and everything. So I have a model here of the thalamus and a portion of the brainstem. I'm just going to point out a few of the features from the actual cadaver brain that weren't too identifiable, just so you can see the landmarks or features a little bit easier. I won't be going through the function. This is more a note for Harrison than anything else. So this would be superior, this would be inferior. If we are looking at the anterior side, which would be towards the front, these two green bulges right there in that deep indentation are your mammillary bodies. So one on either side. And then if we look at the posterior side, we can see these four bulges here. This would be your corpora quadrigemina, and then that's broken down into two different portions. So you have your superior colliculi, which are the two that sit on top, and then your inferior colliculi, which are the two that are on the bottom. So this is looking at a sagittal portion of model where you can see the brain and other such associated central nervous system features. So what you can see here is the cerebellum, the arbor vitae, you can see the fourth ventricle, the central canal, cerebral aqueduct, your third ventricle would be this portion here, the interventricular foramen, your lateral ventricle, this space here. This would be your corpus callosum. These two bulges here would be your corpora quadrigemina, superior colliculi, inferior colliculi, pons, brainstem, mammillary body, your infundibulum, pituitary gland sitting right there inside that solar turcature. This candy cane looking color thing here is your choroid plexus, or an example of your choroid plexus. You would have your thalamus here, your hypothalamus, and then your epithalamus, your pineal gland. So continuing with exercise 15, part A, looking at the ventricles of the brain. The ventricles of the brain is essentially a space within the inside of the brain that allows the movement of your CSF, or your cerebrospinal fluid. Your CSF has a range of functions, mainly in regards to immune function within the central nervous system, buoyancy and protection, and removal of waste. The cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the ependymal cells of the choroid plexus. Essentially, the choroid plexus just lines the entire ventricles themselves in that space, and it produces it directly into what would essentially be this fluid-filled sac inside your brain. So just to run through the table in order, these two large ones that you see are your lateral ventricles, so all of that. If this was sitting properly, this would be superior and this would be inferior. So your two big lateral ventricles on what would be your left and right side. And then you have this part here, which is your third ventricle. And your fourth ventricle is this large bulb right here. Now, the interventricular foramen connects the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. The interventricular foramen is really small, and it's just this little foramen right here. And then the cerebral aqueduct is the last part. What that does is it connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. So it's this really long piece right here. That is your cerebral aqueduct. And then immediately after the fourth ventricle, we come down into what would be the central canal of your spinal cord, and then that would continue down your spinal cord. So with this part here, we are looking at the cranial vault, which is the inside of the head, which if the brain was to be situated here, it would sit inside this cranial vault. We'll be looking at the cranial nerves, which have a large range of functions, either sensory, motor, or in some cases both. Showing you these cranial nerves will be in conjunction with information that's posted about what each cranial nerve does and what its modality is too. So I'll try and go through this really clearly and show you where each cranial nerve is or where it should be, and then we'll take it from there. So the first cranial nerve, your olfactory cranial nerve, so cranial nerve number 1, if it was to be here, your olfactory bulbs would sit right here in what is your cribriform plate, if you remember back to Unit 2. The next one we have, cranial nerve number 2, is our optic nerve. Our optic nerve is this large nerve fiber here on either side, and they run through the optic canal and allow us the sense of vision. Number 3, our oculomotor cranial nerve is next. The oculomotor cranial nerve is this small nerve fiber right here on either side. The oculomotor is responsible for movement of your eyeball muscles. The next one we have is your trochlea. Your trochlea is a little bit hard to see. It sits inside what's the superior orbital fissure, and if it was to be present, it'd be these small bundle of nerve fibers right here. Your trochlea is responsible for the eye muscle, your superior oblique, and only the superior oblique. The next one we have is our trigeminal cranial nerve. The trigeminal cranial nerve, again, projects onto that superior orbital fissure. It has multiple foramen that it goes through. And the trigeminal, number 5, would be this cranial nerve right here, this large bundle of fibers. It gets the name trigeminal because it has 3 divisions to it, so tri-3. The 3 divisions that form the trigeminal are your ophthalmic division, your maxillary division, and your mandibular division. And the trigeminal has functions in both sensory and motor. The next one that you need to know is your abducens. Your abducens is this very small nerve fibers right here on either side that kind of look a little bit like a spaghetti noodle, really. The abducens muscle is responsible for your lateral rectus only. So abducens abduct your eyeball because lateral rectus helps you move that eyeball towards the outside of your body. The next one, we have cranial nerve number 7 and cranial nerve number 8. Cranial nerve number 7 and 8 share the same foramen projection or meatus. Cranial nerve number 7 and 8 are these bundle of fibers right here. Cranial nerve number 7 is your facial. Cranial nerve number 8 is your vestibulocochlear. So your facial cranial nerve is responsible for the functions of sense. So the facial cranial nerve is responsible for facial sensations and a whole range of other functions too, which I'll elaborate on the PowerPoint. Your vestibulocochlear, which also comes off that same projection, is responsible for transmitting the sense of hearing and balance to your brain. The projection they share is the internal auditory meatus. And then 9, 10, and 11, so cranial nerve number 9 being your glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve number 10 being your vagus, and cranial nerve number 11 being your accessory, again, all share the same foramen, the foramen projection. So 9, 10, and 11 would be on this side, it's these bundle of fibers. On this right side, it would be these bundle of fibers right here. Right here. So they go through the jugular foramen. So number 9, your glossopharyngeal, that plays a role in taste and it helps with swallowing. And then number 10, your vagus, that's one of the principal nerves for your parasympathetic system, which is a really big part of lecture, and Scott Taylor will emphasize that further there. And then number 11 is your accessory nerve. your accessory cranial nerve plays a really big role in movements of your neck and your shoulders. So like shrugging your shoulders and all of that, the accessory muscle actually innervates those groups of muscles. The last cranial nerve that you can see in the cranial vault is your hypoglossal. Your hypoglossal is a little bit harder to find because it sits further down the foramen magnum and it projects into the hypoglossal canal, which is that little canal that sits just slightly superior to those occipital condyles. So even though the brainstem is in the way, we kind of can find the hypoglossal canal by moving everything gently out of the way, and it would be this projection right here. So that cranial nerve right there is your hypoglossal cranial nerve. Your hypoglossal cranial nerve plays a role in functions such as taste and swallowing. So cranial nerve number 1, olfactory. Cranial nerve number 2, optic. Cranial nerve number 3, oculomotor. Cranial nerve number 4, your trochlea. Cranial nerve number 5, your trigeminal. Cranial nerve number 6, your abducens. Cranial nerve number 7, your facial. And cranial nerve number 8, your vestibulocochlear. Cranial nerve number 9, your glossopharyngeal. Cranial nerve number 10, your vagus. And cranial nerve number 11, your accessory. And then finally, cranial nerve number 12, hypoglossal.